Cold came off the Cumberland Plateau early that October, settling into the hollows around Harlan County, Kentucky the way cold settles there, not as a visitor but as a permanent resident, resuming its position. Staff Sergeant Isaiah Pruitt had driven up from Middlesboro on a road he knew from childhood and had not been back on in 11 years, past ridgelines that looked exactly as he'd left them and storefronts that didn't, to a house at the end of a gravel lane outside Evarts, where a woman named Lottie Brock had lived alone since her husband passed. In the back seat, Jasper went still in a way Isaiah had never seen. Not the alert stillness of a dog reading danger. Something deeper, something that had no name in the vocabulary of working dogs. The stillness of a dog who has sensed something that requires a different kind of attention entirely. The house looked closed from the lane, curtains drawn against the October light. But one window had a candle burning in it, which meant someone was inside and the electricity had been cut. What Isaiah found when Lottie Brock opened that door would not fully surface for 3 more days. Not until Jasper crossed a specific floorboard in a specific room and sat down and refused to move. And Isaiah got on his knees and found what had been hidden there for 41 years, and sat beside it in the quiet of that house and did not speak for a long time. If this is the kind of story you come here for, subscribe so you're here when the rest of it is told. Isaiah had joined the Marines at 21, the year after the Harlan County mine, where his uncle had worked for 30 years closed, and the uncle had driven to Lexington to look for work and found none, and come back quieter than he'd left. Isaiah had watched that quietness settle over a man he loved and had understood, in the particular way of young men who are paying attention, that the landscape of a life could be altered by forces that had nothing to do with the choices a person made inside it, and that this was intolerable, and that the only answer he knew for intolerable things was to go somewhere he could do something about them. He served 12 years in force reconnaissance, including 2 deployments he spoke about in general terms and one he didn't speak about at all, and he came home to Kentucky in 2021, not to Harlan County, but to Middlesboro, an hour south, because Harlan County was where he was from, and he hadn't yet decided whether he was ready to be back there, or only near there. He worked construction management now. He drove Jasper to every site. He ran in the mornings on the trail above the Cumberland Gap, and came home and made coffee and sat with it in a way that was not quite peace and not quite something else. The way of a man whose interior is still reorganizing itself and has not reached its final configuration. Jasper was a 7-year-old plot hound, brindled, deep-chested, bred for mountain terrain and the tracking of things that don't want to be found. He had a voice that could carry across a hollow and a nose that Isaiah had come to understand as a separate and superior intelligence operating in parallel with his own. He had been bred for bear hunting in these specific mountains, and though he had never tracked a bear in his life, he carried the heritage of it in the way he moved through terrain, with the low and purposeful attention of a dog who understands that what he is looking for is not always where it appears to be. When Isaiah was not sleeping, Jasper would come and lie across the threshold of the bedroom doorway, not inside, not outside, exactly at the boundary, as though he had stationed himself at the place where the 2 states met and was prepared to hold it for as long as necessary. Lottie Brock was 82 years old. She had lived in the house at the end of the gravel lane outside Evarts for 47 years, had moved there as a young woman with her husband Earl in 1977, when coal was still the answer to every question Harlan County asked, and the question of what came after had not yet been asked. Earl had worked the mines for 22 years, and Lottie had worked the Harlan County school system for 31, first as a teacher's aide and then as a librarian. The school librarian in a coal county being a specific kind of person, the keeper of the room where children could go to find out that the world was larger than the ridge. She had been that person with complete seriousness for 31 years. Students who had grown up and moved to Lexington and Louisville and Cincinnati still sent her cards, the way students send cards to the people who showed them something. Earl had died in 2019. Lottie had stayed. The house was where Earl was, in the way that houses hold the people who lived in them past the point of their physical presence. The chair he sat in, the hook where his jacket hung, the coffee mug with the chip in the handle that Lottie had never replaced, because replacing it would have been admitting something she was not yet prepared to admit. She still set his mug out in the morning. She did not fill it. She set it out. She had a daughter named Sylvia who lived in Lexington, who called on Sundays and holidays, and who had, in the last 2 years, been introducing into these calls a recurring theme about the house being too much, and Lottie's situation being unsustainable, and a very nice independent living community in Richmond that had a garden and organized activities, and that Sylvia had already toured twice and had materials for. Lottie had listened to this with the patient courtesy of a woman who has heard an argument many times and has not been persuaded by it and does not intend to be, and who has concluded that the most efficient response is to remain in the house long enough for the argument to exhaust itself. What she had not told Sylvia, had not told anyone, was that the electricity had been cut 6 weeks ago, following a billing dispute that Lottie had initiated, and that the power company had resolved in their own favor. She was managing with candles and a propane camp stove and a battery lantern in the bedroom, the way people managed in these mountains before the grid arrived, and the way certain people managed still when the grid decided they had become inconvenient. She had not called Sylvia, because calling Sylvia would have confirmed the argument Sylvia had been making, and Lottie was not ready to confirm it. Isaiah had come because of a call from his construction foreman, a man named Dwight Pace, who had grown up in Evarts, and whose mother had been in Lottie's library class in 1987, and who had heard from his mother that Lottie was managing without power, and had thought of Isaiah, who lived an hour south, and who had, by Dwight's estimation, both the capability and the disposition for the kind of errand that most people found reasons not to run. Isaiah had said he'd drive up Saturday. He had not told Dwight what he found when he got there. Have you ever driven an hour to check on someone you'd never met? Because someone who knew you trusted you to be the person who would? If you've been that person, or if you've needed that person, tell me about it in the comments. I read every one. Lottie opened the door with the specific wariness of a woman who has been alone long enough that arrivals require assessment. And she assessed Isaiah quickly and thoroughly. The bearing, the truck, the plot hound who was already at the porch steps doing his own assessment of the property in a slow, deliberate circle that suggested he had been here before in some ancestral sense, and was confirming that it matched his expectations. She said, "Dwight sent you." "Yes, ma'am," Isaiah said. She looked at Jasper. "That's a plot." "Yes, ma'am." "Earl had one," she said. She said it to Jasper rather than to Isaiah. Jasper stopped his circle and looked at her. Something passed between them, the specific acknowledgement of a dog who has been named by the right reference, and a woman who has not said that name lightly. "Come in," she said. "I'll put the kettle on." Propane still works. Inside, the house was the temperature of a place that had been heated by candles and a human body for 6 weeks, and had made a reasonable effort at it. Isaiah fixed the electrical panel issue that afternoon. A tripped breaker compounded by a billing dispute that turned out to be a meter misread that turned out to be correctable, with 2 phone calls. The kind of thing that requires someone to make the calls rather than to accept the bill. The power came back on at 4 in the afternoon, and Lottie stood in her kitchen with the overhead light on and looked up at it for a moment with the expression of a woman who has not allowed herself to miss something and is now, in the privacy of its return, permitting herself to feel that she had. Jasper had been moving through the house since they arrived, not restlessly, methodically, in the specific low sweep of a dog following a line that only he could see. He went through the kitchen, the front room, the hallway. He went into the room at the back that had been Earl's study, bookcases, a desk, the chair with the worn left armrest, and he stopped in the center of the room and put his nose to the floor near the baseboard beside the bookcase and stood there. Then he sat down. He did not move. He did not look at Isaiah. He looked at the floor. Isaiah crossed to him. The floorboard beside the baseboard was not visibly different from the boards around it. Same age, same weathering, same gray-brown of old hardwood that has been swept but not refinished for 30 years. But it gave a fraction when Isaiah put his weight on it, the specific give of a board that has been lifted and replaced many times over many years. The wood along its edges worn smooth in a way that was not wear from foot traffic, but wear from hands. He looked at Lottie, who had come to the doorway of the study. Her face had changed. Not alarm, something older than alarm. Something that had been waiting a long time to be looked at and was now being looked at, and did not know yet whether that was a relief or a reckoning. Jasper found something, Isaiah said. Not a question. Lottie was quiet for a moment. She looked at the floor. She looked at Jasper, who had not moved. He has a good nose, she said. He does, Isaiah said. He waited. She crossed the room and knelt beside the board with the ease of a woman who had done this many times, lifted it with both hands in the practiced way of someone who has been the only person who knew this compartment existed, and reached into the space beneath. She brought out a tin, the kind that once held tea, the lid fitted close, sealed with age. She held it for a moment without opening it. Then she held it out. Isaiah took it. He opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in a cloth that had once been a handkerchief, was a photograph, black and white, 5 inches by 7, the edges soft with age. He looked at it for a long time. He sat down on the floor of Earl's study, in the house that had held this secret for 41 years, and he did not speak. The photograph showed a young woman in an army uniform. She was perhaps 22 years old. She was standing in front of a building that Isaiah recognized as the kind of institutional building that appeared in a specific decade's military photographs. Low, functional, characteristic of the late 1960s. She was not smiling in a posed way. She was smiling in the way of a person who has just done something they are proud of and has not yet arranged their face back into its usual expression. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting that was younger than the Lottie Brock, who was standing in the doorway watching him, Fort McClellan, Alabama, Women's Army Corps, July 1969. If you're watching this and you know someone who served and never told anyone, never talked about it, never claimed it, never let it be part of how the world knew them, I want to hear about them. Leave their name in the comments. That service belongs to them, and it deserves to be spoken. Lottie had served. She had enlisted in the Women's Army Corps in 1968 at 26, and had been trained as a medical records specialist at Fort McClellan. She had served 18 months. She had been honorably discharged in 1970 and had come home to Harlan County and married Earl and become the school librarian and built a life that was real and full and had not, in any of it, mentioned the 18 months. She told Isaiah the reason over the propane stove that evening, with the overhead light back on and Jasper lying at her feet in the specific way of a plothound who has found the thing he was tracking and is now content to remain beside it. Earl had known. She had told him before they married, and he had said 4 words. That's part of you. And that had been enough between them. It had been the whole of the conversation, because Earl was that kind of man. But the county was not Earl. The county in 1970 was not a place where a woman who had come back from 18 months in the army talked about it at the TA meeting, or the library board, or the church fellowship. Because the county had its own idea of what women did, and it was not that. And Lottie had understood. With the practical intelligence of a woman who had grown up navigating the gap between who she was and what was permitted, that the useful thing was to keep the photograph under the floorboard and be Lottie Brock the librarian in all the ways that mattered, and to keep the other thing for Earl and for the tin and for the room at the back. 41 years the tin had been under the board. Earl had died. The tin had stayed. Isaiah listened without speaking until she was finished. He thought about his uncle driving to Lexington and coming back quieter. He thought about a gunnery sergeant from his second deployment, named Roland Fitch, who had been from Breathitt County, 2 ridges north of Harlan, and who had said once on a fire watch in Helmand Province that the thing about where they were from was that you learned early what to hide and what to show, and that the skills transferred. Roland had been killed 6 weeks later, and Isaiah had carried the sentence for 4 years before he understood what it had been teaching him. He thought about what it meant to serve and come home and put your uniform under a floorboard, because the place you came home to had not earned the right to see it. Then he said, "You qualify for veterans' benefits you've never received." Lottie looked at him. The expression on her face was the expression of a woman being told something she had allowed herself not to know for a long time. "I wasn't sure it applied," she said. The whack was, "It applies," Isaiah said. It always applied. The urgency arrived the next morning in a call from Dwight Pace. Sylvia had called Dwight. How she had gotten his number was a question Isaiah set aside for later, and had told him that she was coming to Evarts the following Friday with a document she needed Lottie to sign, related to the independent living community in Richmond, related to the house, related to an arrangement that Sylvia had described to Dwight as in Lottie's best interest, and that Dwight, who had grown up in Evarts and knew what arrangements described as best interests usually meant, had described to Isaiah as something he should know about. Friday was 6 days out. Isaiah drove back to Middlesbrough and made 2 calls that afternoon. The first was to a Veterans Services coordinator at the VA regional office in Lexington named Gerald Oakes, who confirmed that Lottie's wax service qualified her for a benefits package that included in-home support, healthcare supplements, and a caregiver stipend, and that the application could be expedited given the circumstances. The second was to a housing attorney in Harlan named Bet Combs, who had been practicing in the county for 29 years, and who said, when Isaiah described the document Sylvia intended to bring, the word coercion once, and then said she would be at the house on Thursday. He drove back to Evarts on Wednesday with Jasper and a bag of groceries, and spent the day doing the things that needed doing. The back step was loose. There was a gutter bracket on the north side that had pulled away from the fascia. The storm window in Earl's study had a broken latch that had been admitting cold air through a gap that the curtain had been masking. He fixed all of it with the methodical efficiency of a man who has been trained to assess a structure and address what he finds. And Lottie watched him from the kitchen, and did not tell him not to, and did not thank him, because Lottie Brock was the kind of woman who received practical help with the dignity of someone who would have done the same without making a production of it. On Thursday evening, over the propane stove with the overhead light on, and Jasper across both their feet under the kitchen table, Lottie opened the tin again and took the photograph out and held it. Earl used to ask to see it, she said, every so often. He'd just hold it for a minute and then put it back. Isaiah said nothing. He never asked me to talk about it more than I wanted to, she said. He just wanted me to know he hadn't forgotten it was there. Isaiah thought about Roland Fitch. He thought about the sentence from Helmand Province and what it had taken him 4 years to understand. He said, "You should hang it up." Lottie looked at the photograph. Then she looked at Isaiah with the specific expression of a woman being offered something she had stopped believing was available. "In here?" she said. "In here," he said. Sylvia arrived on Friday morning in a silver sedan with a folder on the passenger seat that she brought to the door with the specific briskness of a person who has scheduled this conversation and is prepared to complete it efficiently. She was 54 years old, competent and well-intentioned in the way of people who have decided what is best for someone else and organized their intentions into paperwork. She knocked, and Isaiah opened the door. Jasper was at Isaiah's left side, positioned forward, his body between the door and the kitchen where Lottie sat. The sound that came out of him was the voice of a plot hound stripped of its hunting register and reduced to its essential core, low, without break. The declaration of a dog who has tracked the thing he was tracking and is now between it and whatever comes next. Sylvia looked at Jasper. Jasper looked at Sylvia with the full and unbroken attention of a dog who has slept at a threshold for 2 nights and knows exactly what he is guarding. Bet Combs was at the kitchen table. Gerald Oakes had driven from Lexington and was at the kitchen table. A neighbor named Harlan Brock, no relation, the county was full of Brocks, who had known Lottie and Earl for 30 years and who had come when Isaiah called him because that was the kind of man he was, stood near the window with his arms at his sides, in the quiet way of a man prepared to stand there for as long as it takes. And Lottie was at her kitchen table in the house she had lived in for 47 years, and on the wall above the mantel in the front room, visible through the kitchen doorway, was a black and white photograph in a frame that had belonged to Earl, hung there the previous evening. A young woman in an Army uniform, standing in front of a building at Fort McClellan, Alabama, in July 1969, smiling the way you smile when you've just done something you're proud of. Sylvia came in. She saw the photograph on the wall. She looked at it for a moment. Something moved across her face that was more complex than any of the expressions in any of the previous 8 stories in this series. Not guilt exactly. Not surprise exactly, the specific and compound expression of a daughter seeing her mother for the first time, in a frame she had not known existed. She sat down without being asked. She didn't open the folder. Bet Combs explained the Veterans Benefits application and what it covered and what it meant for Lottie's ability to remain in the house. Gerald Oakes explained the timeline for the in-home support services. Isaiah described the repairs completed in the past 2 days, and the work remaining, and the structural assessment he had completed as a licensed professional, which showed the house to be sound and manageable with routine maintenance. He did not describe any of this as evidence against Sylvia. He described it as information about the house, what it was, what it needed, what it was worth to the woman who had lived in it for 47 years. Sylvia looked at the folder in front of her. She looked at the photograph on the wall. She looked at her mother. Then Lottie said, "I was going to tell you." 5 words. She said it to Sylvia's face, looking at her daughter with the gentle directness of a woman who has been keeping something in a tin under a floorboard for 41 years and has decided that the keeping is finished. It was not a reproach. It was a door opening. Sylvia looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then she looked at her mother. Her eyes were wet. She said, "Tell me now." Jasper sat down. What happened in the weeks that following was quieter than any of the previous resolutions in this series, because the wrong that had been done here was not malice. It was the accumulated weight of decades of a daughter not fully knowing who her mother was, and the simple, unhurried process of that being corrected. The Veterans Benefits application was approved with expedited processing. The in-home support services began in November. The document in Sylvia's folder was never signed, not because it was contested, but because Sylvia drove back to Lexington and made a phone call canceling the Richmond arrangement. And when she came back the following weekend, she came without a folder. Bet Combs was not needed again, though she sent Lottie a card that said she was glad to have been called. The photograph stayed on the wall. Isaiah drove up from Middlesbrough twice more before the snow came, and both times Lottie had coffee ready, and Jasper went directly to the rug in Earl's study and lay down beside the bookcase as though the room had been his all along. On the second visit, Sylvia was there, and the three of them sat at the kitchen table, and Lottie talked for 2 hours about Fort McClellan and the Women's Army Corps and the 18 months she had kept in a tin for 4 decades. And Sylvia listened with the full attention of a daughter, hearing something for the first time that had always been true. Lottie Brock had served her country before she became the school librarian, before she became Earl's wife, before she became the woman who set his mug out every morning without filling it. She had been that person first. She had kept the photograph because some things are too important to lose and too dangerous to show. And she had learned to hold both truths at once for 41 years. Isaiah Pruitt had the same Saturday morning as anyone else. Dwight Pace said there was a woman outside Evarts who needed checking on, and Isaiah said he'd drive up, and that had been the whole of the decision. The floorboard did the rest. Jasper had a better nose. He usually does. This story is for every veteran who came home and put the uniform away in a place where it would be safe, because safe was the only word they had. And for anyone who has ever learned something true about a person they thought they already knew, and chosen, instead of surprised, to say, "Tell me more." Is there someone in your life who served and never talked about it? A grandmother, a grandfather, a neighbor who kept something in a tin? Tell me their name in the comments. That service belongs to them. It deserves to be spoken. Every story on this channel is about the things that have been waiting to be found. If that means something to you, subscribe, so you're here for the next one. There are more stories to tell. Which moment in this story stayed with you? I'll see you in the comments.